Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here again in the studio with Josh on the campus of UT Austin. We've been on hiatus for a couple of weeks. I think hiatus is, I like hiatus.
Yeah, well, since
it's so non-explanatory.
But it sounds like it's a fun, like hijinks may have ensued
it sounds
while
like
you were on
something
hiatus.
you did, on purpose in kind of vaguely Latin terms.
Yeah, that's good.
So we've been on hiatus for a couple of weeks of the holidays, end of the semester, a little travel. Inevitably, this has all altered everyone's schedules, but we're back this week. And we thought being back this week, we'd look at some of the more interesting Texas 2022 races, how they're shaping up as 2021 limps to an end. And by limp, I mean, this is like end of the Terminator limp. I mean, like missing an arm, missing a leg, dragging through.
Remember when 2021 started?
Yeah, it's like, whoo, this is so glad 2020's over. We're going to hear a lot of that, I think, in the next 2 weeks. So we won't belabor that. Let's start in the middle of the ticket and talk a little bit about the Texas Attorney General race. And you and I have been talking about this offline a bit, as have many people. I mean, this race has been interesting for a while as a result of the perceived vulnerability of incumbent Republican Ken Paxton. And I want to put a pin on perceived vulnerability because we should come back to that. But Paxton from the, early on drew a crowded field of fairly interesting challengers, right? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of the attention to this in some sense is a reflection of the field too. Right? I mean, part of it you already raised, which is there's this perceived vulnerability, which we'll come back to. And then I think, the other reason it's obviously generating a lot of attention is that there are three, there have been three, we'll say, throughout, and I mean, I almost want to say well-known candidates, but that's not true because they're not well-known. But let's say
they're interesting.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is the issue, right? This is why it's interesting. You say, well, is it three formidable candidates? It's like, well, I'm not sure about that. And it's like, well, but it says it's three candidates who have electoral experience, right?
Yeah,
and that's
bingo on that.
I think that's the important thing here is they have three candidates who, in at least two cases have run statewide, have raised money. Well, actually, and in the case of now Representative Gohmert, has his own sort of, I would say following and brand within the GOP in the state.
Right.
So that's, so there's definitely reason to pay attention. At the same time, it's it's sort of like there's a lot of ifs thens kind of pieces to this that are sort of hard to suss out. And it's interesting because I think both of us have talked to a lot of reporters about this race, and I would almost say surprisingly, but not. So what I just said at the outset is like this is a very interesting race on its face, but it's actually a lot more interesting for other reasons, probably.
Right. So just to get it clear, so we've got former Texas Supreme Court Justice Eva Guzman, Land Commissioner George P. Bush, and now Congressman Louis Gohmert, who I think is not filed yet, though.
Which he may never. I mean,
which he might not. The filing deadline is Monday.
Yeah.
And we're recording this on Thursday before the filing deadline of Monday. And we had briefly Matt Krause,
right,
current state legislator, not running for re-election. And then Gohmert got in and Krause got out.
Yeah, to run for, I think, the
county attorney.
Yeah,
I think that's right. So what did you? So you said this is like it's interesting on the face of it for all the reasons you were laying out. I mean, at least for people that follow politics, people know who Eva Guzman is.
Yeah.
People know who George P. Bush is. Obviously, George P. Bush has been, a character now, if only a supporting character in Texas politics for a while. Son of Jeb Bush, for a while seen as a potential new face of the Republican Party in Texas. That's become complicated, shall we say.
Yeah.
And so, there is a sense that this is not, as you were saying, like, it's interesting, it's not, it's competitive, is it not, is it, or it's interesting, more interesting for this or that reason. I mean, I think one of the things we have to step back and look is that, we haven't had very many competitive Republican primaries in the last couple of cycles.
Right.
Little bit here, little glimmers here and there, but certainly statewide, there's just not been a lot that's gone on really since 2014.
Yeah, I was going to say the closest that I can think of is Dan Patrick, winning that primary against Dewhurst and Staples and Patterson, right?
Yeah, and there was a bit of competition. That comptroller's race was competitive that year. I mean, 2014 there was some business going on. There were some open,
But they were opening. I mean,
there was an open office at the gubernatorial
but that's why it's a little
levels.
bit different, right? I mean, the open office made for some shifting, whereas this is, let's take a step back. Well, why is this less interesting than it appears? Let me just say that first. So, real quick, the case for that is that, Paxton's job approval among Republicans basically sits in the same place as Dan Patrick's for the most part,
right?
Which I'd say
mid 60s.
Yeah, mid high 60s. So 65% approve of the job Paxton's doing among Republicans, 12 disapprove. Patrick, who we're not talking about at all because we assume he's perfectly safe, sits at 67 approve, 9 disapprove. So it's not as though there's like a wellspring of dissatisfaction with Ken Paxton. And the other piece I think about this that's important is that Ken Paxton has spent since before going to the Attorney General's office, really, cultivating a brand and a relationship with, activated constituencies in the Republican primary. And ultimately, he doesn't really look as vulnerable as I think the context around which we're looking at the race makes it appear. But this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? So I think, you think about, to me, I think about Bush and Guzman in some ways like a kind of like the institutional lane. There seems to be kind of two lanes, right? There's the institutional lane, and then there's the more familiar right lane. Basically, who is the most conservative. Now, ultimately, Ken Paxton has been pretty conservative as Attorney General. Yeah. We haven't talked about this in a long time, but just as a quick thing, just to throw this out there, this is something the Attorney General gets to do, right? I mean, for the most part, they get to choose when they're going to file suit. They put out press releases. They have a lot of ability to select the issues that they want to emphasize. And Paxton, like Abbott before him, has done this really well to advance I think his political brand. So if anything, if I take it all at face value, sort of the Krause jumping in the race kind of is the quote unquote true conservative, and then Gohmert jumping in and him jumping out on its face kind of says how small that lane probably is to begin with. I mean,
the lane itself is reasonably large, but Paxton is occupying it. Yeah,
right. I was saying
right. How much room there is in
how
the
many
lane.
lanes are on the highway? There's not, there's a shoulder over here, right?
And just, just not that anybody listening to this doesn't know this, but just to set the background. And also, Ken Paxton has been under indictment, first for some, tax and business practice issues. And now
some issues with, at the SEC and filings.
Right. And now is involved in, some legal issues that have to do with people that worked with him who filed complaints about how he had handled the job, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a very generous way to describe.
Well, I'm a generous guy.
But this is the issue here, actually. I mean, to some extent, this is where it gets more interesting to me. I don't think that Paxton per se is in trouble in this primary. And the main reason is Bush is the most well-known opponent of his, and Republicans are split on him. 34% have a favorable view, 28% have an unfavorable view. Those who describe themselves as extremely conservative, he's underwater. 28 have a favorable view, 39 have an unfavorable view. We could go into a whole speculation as well as, is it the Alamo? Is it Dan Patrick? Is it the Bush brand? It's not really the point here, but the point is to say he's not as formidable as he looks.
It's almost certainly all of the above.
Yeah, and Guzman is largely unknown to most candidates. So what's interesting to me about this is when and how strongly do Bush and Guzman make the case that, look, the Attorney General might be a liability in the general election if the FBI investigation advances to a certain point between now and next November. But I don't think that necessarily hurts him in this primary. The thing is if they're aggressive about it, it becomes part of the campaign against him in the fall.
Right. I mean, we should also mention, so, you were talking about public opinion and the reads of that. And in the, we did a trial ballot in October, which, I wouldn't read very much into at this point. And Paxton was at 48, 49?
Yeah, he was at 48%. He was at 57% among strong Republicans. He's at 66% amongst those who say they're extremely conservative. Yeah.
It suggests that, he has played this. Lest we forget, he was under indictment last time he ran and won. Mm-hmm.
But it was a close race. I mean, I think there's an institutional reason why
he's attracting more challengers.
Yeah. Right. But ultimately, I think, neither challenger has been super aggressive at this point, it seems to me, about, raising the issues that they're really concerned about. And I'm not sure if they're going to.
Well, the other piece of this that's interesting going into a primary is that there's been some divisions in, the traditionally relatively unified interest group community, and that Texans for Lawsuit Reform has endorsed Guzman.
Yeah. Which,
raised a lot of eyebrows and suggested that there is some, at least, perception of vulnerability there. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that also has to be baked into this. I mean, we're in a kind of shadow campaign stage right now where there's a lot of, there's a lot of active seeking of endorsements out there.
Yeah, I mean, I still think a lot would have to happen to unseat Paxton. I think the question really is just how much damage is done to him in addition to what else is out there before he goes into the general. Because, Justin Nelson ran a pretty formidable campaign with against Paxton last time, with the whole premise being to say indicted attorney general. And now it becomes indicted under FBI investigation attorney general. And the thing, and people already heard the other one. So, I mean, this is, it does creates an issue.
Well, I mean, let me say this. You seem like, you're sort of saying you don't think, how much trouble does he have to be in with this many people in the field running theoretically at least legit campaigns with some resources, which I think Guzman and Bush and probably Gohmert will have, to get in, to not make 50%. I mean, that's obviously the game here.
Yeah, that's the big game here. Yeah. I mean, we'll see.
I think that's a trickier proposition.
Well, I mean, I guess here's a question for you. I mean, do you think?
Well, let me ask you.
I mean, do you think that he's more in trouble in this primary or in the general?
I think he's almost certainly more in trouble in the primary.
But do you think it's a lot of trouble?
I think it's enough trouble that they've got to try pretty hard.
Yeah.
I don't think, when was the last time Ken Paxton had to try in a primary? Probably never, even going back to when he was in the Senate. I mean, trouble is a big word, but I mean, I think that they are not in a position of being able to assume that they're going to get out of the primary without a runoff right now.
We'll see. I mean,
there's just too. I mean, I just think there's too many candidates, and that doesn't mean that they can't make it happen if they can't push somebody out of the race or.
See, here's why I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be skeptical just because it's the same reason we're not talking about any other races in some ways, or why we're talking about so few other races, is because, the perception is that there's this, strong set of candidates. And part of it is, well, relative to what? And it's like, well, relative to, if we say Lee Merritt and Joe Jaworski on the Democratic side, who nobody knows.
Right.
Right. And it's going to be a struggle for them from now until November to become known to people.
Right.
And I look at, basically Paxton and say, yeah, there's some people that insiders definitely know. And obviously the interest, group universe is moving around and kind of thinking about the long-term game. But I think for most, sort of Republican primary, there's two things. One, Ken Paxton is one of the good guys among that group.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like not only, is he good with Trump, he was at the January 6th rally. I mean, nobody can express their bona fides more in some really weird, twisted way. Right.
Yes. I'm trying to think of a good comparative analogy to using your presence at the January 6th rally as a bona fide, but I don't know.
Well, this was sick. I was thinking about this morning.
I don't want to be too flip with that.
Well, I mean, just at risk of being too flip, I was thinking this morning about if Gohmert became the main sort of antagonist, and the idea of Ken Paxton saying, "Hey, you were on the wrong side of that rally."
Right, because you weren't there.
You were on the inside.
Right.
I mean, so, I mean, who knows?
I guess I agree with all of that. I just think numbers-wise, there's a matter of incentives. I mean, I think if you're Guzman, you're Bush, and especially if there's a fourth candidate, if Gohmert does, in fact, file for the race,
we'll see.
The threshold is just dramatically lowered for all of them.
Yeah.
Right. And for all of them, for all of the challengers, right. I mean, what you're doing is you're competing for.
Yeah. You each want to get 20% and you want to get.
Yeah. If you get 20%,
you're probably okay.
You're great. Right. So I'm
skeptical.
I mean, I don't think it's a sure thing, but I think that, it's a classic damning with faint praise. I don't think any of them have to do very much. All three of them just have to do enough to push it into a runoff, and then, the conventional wisdom, if you're an incumbent that gets pushed in a runoff, you're at a pretty serious disadvantage. Right. And, the conventional wisdom is, often, more the former than the latter. But I mean, it will be the story that comes out of the election if, all things being equal, if Paxton winds up, having to go into a runoff on this.
I'm just not sure that there's even 50% of Republican primary voters who have opinions about the other three candidates.
Well, they don't. No, they don't right now.
I'm saying overlapping, right?
But I guess that's the point about the interest group universe. So if you're Eva Guzman, and you can raise at least some money, and you've got Texans for Lawsuit Reform and some associated groups willing to start, making, as many phone calls and mailings as they possibly can for you, can you get yourself to 20% or move enough people off him? I mean, I just think it's not.
But it's good. But if you're going to do that, it's going to have to be on these charges of basically corruption, corruption.
Right. And Guzman's in a pretty good position for that, given her political.
Yeah, I guess I wonder how much the interest. I mean, I guess the question then becomes: is the interest group universe, comfortable now that they've gone as far as to make the endorsement, going a step further?
Well,
and torching him.
I think there's no going back now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that decision has been. I think that question has been asked and answered among some of these groups. And look, I'm a little surprised by it, given that this is not the only Paxton in the political system right now.
Yeah.
And where there is a state senator who's, I'm sure there's a Chinese wall being built here in some ways.
Really?
As I recall, the senator.
Sure? Don't be so sure.
As I recall, the senator was also at the rally. So, I think there's some interesting fluidity to this. I guess I think the point is, I would just say this. I mean, I would not bet much on this going to a runoff, but I'd bet a little. And if you gave me some points, I'd probably put a little bit on it because of the numbers, but we'll see. So let's switch over now and look there. You mentioned, the other side, the general election. We also had a little bit of, we've seen a little bit of movement in this as well. But there is a field of candidates, and I'm kind of wondering why Justin Nelson isn't running again.
Yeah, I mean, this is, but this is again.
He was certainly bullish on his effort last time.
Well, and this kind of goes,
came close. Objectively, it seems like he'd want to come back.
Well, I think this goes back to something that, like we talk about this stuff a lot, like, so what are the set pieces and what are the short-term factors? Mm-hmm. And it just, I can't help but look across all this and say, this one race we're looking at, it's the attorney general's race right now, and there's a reason for it. It's a vulnerability, but it's also, because of these candidates there. But one of the things about this, and it's sort of, I think it cuts across all the races here, is Texas is so damn big. It's so expensive. And this is a reason for someone like Justin Nelson to run again. He's already put himself out there. A lot of people have voted for him, right?
As he repeatedly pointed out.
Yes, he repeatedly pointed out. He's very bullish on his chances. But part of the issue, you've brought this up before, which is, Democrats, it's sort of hard to get Democrats to run multiple times. And I think especially statewide where it's such a grueling it's just such a grueling endeavor when you don't have the power incumbency. You can't, you're not Ken Paxton who can sit there and basically just put out a press release and, create some news for yourself and put your name around something. You got to work and you got to raise a ton of money. There's a ton of markets. And so, to some extent, I would say it is on the part of Democrats, it's lame that they can't get candidates to run more often, but also you have to just acknowledge that it's really hard. It's hard for anyone trying to challenge an incumbent within a primary. It's hard for anyone trying to challenge the incumbents in the general election. And so we seem to get this sort of rotating cast of characters, but very little repeats. Yeah.
And again, there are candidates in the race on the other side, and I don't want to, zero that out. But I think it is striking that, and there was a lot of discussion during the legislature about, there were always rumblings that some of the people that are involved in kind of criminal justice and legal stuff on the Democratic side, particularly in the Senate, are,
Yeah.
thinking about getting in the AG's race, and none of that has really materialized.
Yeah.
And, and I get it. I mean, the objective structural conditions right now.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about this some other podcast, but I was looking into legislative turnover this last week because kind of, there's been a lot of attention on the number of retirements we've seen in the legislature. And, too long didn't read version is it looks pretty normal, actually, especially kind of around a redistricting cycle.
Right.
Right now, 29 people in the House or Senate have either said they're retiring or seeking a different office. The average, not including this session, is about 30. Now, admittedly, we'll have primaries or general elections, but since we're coming out of the redistricting process, we're not really going to add that many changes after that, probably. I mean, we might add a few, but it's not going to be like in terms of high watermarks for session turnover, not likely to be unless something happens.
Well, and it's still not, I think we've not probably quite seen, we'll see in the next few days how much more turnover we see.
But to connect this back, I mean, what's interesting, I think, over the more recent term that, people might not kind of appreciate is that most of the retirements have been on the Republican side.
Yeah.
So more often than not, when we look at these retirements, it's Republicans who are retiring. Now,
there's also more upward mobility. There's more.
Well, this is the thing. And this is why we're writing something up, and I'm working. Part of it is like there's all kinds of ways you can interpret this data, but one of the possibilities is for if you look at Republicans, you're right. There's more upward mobility. So ultimately, and that's the flip side of that is for Democrats, there's not more upward mobility. There's a smaller number of seats,
right.
And so when you've got one. It's not like you can just jump to another position unless you're going to go, say, be the mayor of Houston.
Right.
For example.
I didn't mean to pick on the Democratic senators per se, but
no, I'm just pointing out. I think it's just a fact. I mean, I think we've had conversations with Democrats before where they basically say to the effect, this is working. Over the years.
Yeah, and you're giving up something for a long shot at nothing, and so I get that, but I. That does bring attention then to, some of the other things that have been happening in some of the other races. In the you mentioned how Dan Patrick, was,
right.
roughly the position that in terms of his job approval among Republicans, that Paxton was. Not much happening on that side in that race, but it's been a little frothy in the lieutenant governor's side on the Democratic side.
A little frothy.
Well,
yes. A wee bit.
A wee bit. So Matthew Dowd jumped in that race to, some degree of I would say national, if not state acclaim.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He got a lot of, ironically, I think, Matthew Dowd is probably better known to a national audience than he is to a state audience, as we found in our polling when we polled on him. But, Matthew got in and then he got out.
Well, he cleared the way. His work here was done.
So Matthew Dowd announced earlier this week that he'd be suspending his campaign for the nomination for lieutenant governor. And the announcement was interesting that he would be clearing the way for a more diverse field, and he was, he looks forward to, continuing the fight against Trumpism, et cetera, I think.
This is like a separate conversation, maybe for another time, but I think about, Dowd, I think about Krause, and I think about McConaughey as just kind of using the space that was provided to sort of lift their name IDs. And
almost certainly the only time that Matt Krause will ever be mentioned in the same conversation as Matthew McConaughey and Matthew Dowd.
Well, I'm trying to, look, I'm not a conspiratorial person. This isn't even conspiracy. This is just, tactics. I kind of wonder how serious Krause was about the AG race and whether he wasn't all along kind of, by sort of shooting for the AG race and saying, well, but actually I'm going to go back to the county. It's like, well, you did the book list, you got the, round of articles about the AG race, and now, it's a pretty good, honestly, it's a pretty good strategic ploy if it were a strategic ploy to get your name out there. But anyway, I digress. Yeah. But the space was there. It seems like a lot of people are using this space, at least in a way that I haven't seen recently.
Yeah. It's funny as you were talking about that, and that, you do see people move around this point in the cycle.
Yeah.
There's also a cyclical thing. I think, you were talking about redistricting in terms of turnover. That's another thing. There's a certain amount of just, disruption that's happened and shifting around that has consequences downstream. This is also happening as Michelle Beckley is in that race, state representative. who has decided she will run for the nomination.
And she was basically redistricted.
Right.
out.
And she was somebody who got one of the, interestingly, I think we talked about this last time we were together. It was an interesting part of the strategy that Republicans took in terms of protecting many incumbent Democrats, although singling some out, particularly in the House also in the Senate, singling a few Democrats out for some negative attention and redistricting. Beckley was one of those. And then we've also got a new entrance in the governor's race, and I think you did a media hit on this yesterday.
I did.
Joy Diaz, who I guess in some form of disclosure, we've both done. I think we've both done stuff. I've definitely done stuff with Joy
if I have.
over the years.
Probably.
When she was at KUT, and then on the Texas Standard. I was a little surprised by this.
Yeah.
I mean, not that it's great. Whatever, free country. But if you had said, hey, would you have thought that Joy Diaz was going to run for governor? I don't think there would have been very many people. I haven't asked people at KUT, but.
Well, she's running for the Democratic nomination for governor, and she's got a pretty big uphill fight to claim that nomination, first and foremost. I mean, it's funny, there's this is like only partially about Joy Diaz, but it's sort of something that's going on now a lot, which another sort of set of like versions of questions I get a lot are basically to explain whatever just happened via the lens of South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley. And like, this has happened multiple times, and I understand the impulse. But I mean, what I was, so what someone's basically asked is like, well, is this, is Beto going to have a problem in the Valley because, she's got a Hispanic name, she's a woman, all this. And I was like, to me, honestly, the surname thing is sort of helpful around the margins. I think the fact that she was on KUT and statewide NPR radio, where a lot of Democrats probably heard her, is a bigger advantage than her last name. She actually probably has some general awareness amongst, like a group that probably includes a lot of Democratic primary voters, just to be honest. But ultimately, it's, if she didn't have that experience, would we be like even mentioning her at all?
It's
interesting. I'll say one other thing. There was a whole thing last primary where like, Beto underperformed in the Valley. And we looked at that, right? And we said, well, first of all, he was still getting majority votes in most of the counties. Number one. Number two, if you go back and you look at his campaign schedule, and this is sort of an interesting broader point, but he didn't spend any time in South Texas leading up to that Democratic primary. He was around the big cities. And just say...
taking time to go to all the, remember the whole...
all the counties. Yeah. But also, like, he was spending most of his time in that primary where most of the votes are.
Yeah.
And that's something about, first, this frame, which is, number one, the RGV accounts for like a little bit under 3% of the statewide vote total. If Greg Abbott is spending all of his time in the RGV and Beto O'Rourke is spending all of his time in the RGV, then it's a pretty competitive election we got going on. Like, so let's just, there's further sort of, optics of this and, trying to create a story. But I think this is a different campaign for O'Rourke in that he's already spending a bunch of time in the Valley because you know what? He doesn't really need to be on every college campus.
Right.
He already has a lot of the Democratic vote. I wouldn't say locked up, but, at least it's his to lose. And so that's sort of, not to, count Joy Diaz out before she runs, but like, it's just a different race than it was last time.
Right. And there were people that tried to make, as I recall, and I'm just thinking about this, so I didn't prepare it for the podcast. There were people who tried to make hay of the fact that, in the 2018 primary, there was a Hispanic surname candidate that was polling reasonably well going in, but I don't think that came to much when we saw the final vote totals, as I recall.
Well, she did okay in some of the South Texas counties and things like that they use. But again, you kind of go back and you say, everybody again was saying, well, O'Rourke's not, it's like O'Rourke got like the most votes of any Democrat in a primary up until that point. I was saying this sort of jokingly in something else recently that I was at, which is, there's these sort of expectations that we learn that people apparently always had, but that they don't tell us about until after we actually get the election results. And then they can tell us how someone underperformed.
Right.
And it's like, well, look, put a number out there. I just say, again, I don't care, but it's like, if O'Rourke, if people feel like O'Rourke needs to be above some threshold, say what that threshold is right now.
Right.
Don't wait until after we have the primaries and O'Rourke gets like 65, 70% of the vote. So, well, if he's not getting 80% of the vote, clearly,
there's something wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, let's just take it easy.
Well, I think, I think Joy Diaz being in the race is an interesting development, I think, and, for a lot of the reasons you're kind of alluding to.
Also, just her natural, her history and her experience are going to give her an advantage. And, she's someone who she can go in public. She can talk.
She's not going to have to learn how to ask and answer questions.
Exactly.
She's not,
she definitely has advantages to other candidates, but She also has a major disadvantage, which is her name's not Beto O'Rourke, and she's not known to 100% of Democratic voters.
So I want to finish a little bit just on, like, I do want to talk just for the last couple minutes. I mean, so we've had, the Dowd bubble, the McConaughey bubble. There's an interesting dynamic here that, reporters have been talking about going in. And of course, you and I have been on the podcast, and certainly, to reporters, sort of dour about these things in a little.
That's really generous.
Yeah. Dour is even, I mean, dour, I think, was good for the mood of the state last time. It's probably a little mild for how we've been about this. But, there is something very interesting, in the kind of media, the intersection of the media environment and politics about how these flashy objects appear in particularly in the Democrats' field of vision, and then really just don't play out. I mean, and I think, we probably spent a lot of time talking about context, and it really is interesting how context is so important for these campaigns to achieve takeoff. And I think there's something really in the moment, like there are these fantasies that there's like a third branch centrist approach out there.
Yeah.
That, both Dowd and McConaughey kind of tossed out there. Dowd, had a legitimate, I think, well thought out. I mean, whether you think it was effectual or not, but, being involved in these kind of third way movements and organizations and stuff. McConaughey, in I think a significantly less sophisticated way, was trying to project that, he was neither this nor that, and people are too partisan, and, he just wants good government, kind of thing. And it's just so ill-suited to the moment.
I'm trying to be, I want to be a little bit careful in the way I briefly respond to this, because I agree with you. And there is, I would add to that, there's also a lot of like, sort of I'm interested, sort of research infrastructure out there that's trying to prove that this is true.
Yeah.
Right? Where people basically, well, no, Americans aren't really, so divided. There's all these, really it's like this. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of like saying, no, it's not about whether you like Coke or Pepsi. It's whether you like this third thing that doesn't exist, that you've never had before.
Bananas.
Yeah, and it's like, well, but I don't want a banana.
Right. I was thinking about soft drinks over here.
Well, it's like, and also I really, really hate Pepsi. And that's the thing that I think we sort of, forget. I mean, we've sort of had this piece we're sitting on forever about negative partisanship here, but it's not even so much the fact, I mean, what people need to stop when they're sort of thinking about this. It's not even so much that like you're so committed to your party in America that like you would, I don't even want to say anything, but like, you would do whatever for it. It's the fact that you hate the other party so much. The Democrats dislike the Republican Party so much, and Republicans really dislike the Democratic Party and Democratic politicians so much. And so you sort of take that and you say, they're not looking to jettison both.
Right.
They're just trying to keep the other one out of power. And the idea that something can kind of come in from another dynamic or another dimension and sort of say, yeah, but what about this? And it's like, yeah, but it takes you think about like, party infrastructure, financing, getting all this stuff. It's like the Democrats here barely have that. And they're one of the two major parties. The idea that something's going to organically come up from the ground and sort of provide something to people that they're not clearly asking for. It's just, to me, it's just kind of fantasy.
Yeah.
But I think it also is, it's a symptom of the dysfunction overall in government that, people are at least, I think, open to sort of having these discussions repeatedly about, this kind of change. But I think, as we study politics, we have degrees and all that kind of stuff. That kind of change happens, but it's pretty.
Yeah.
It's a little bit less.
Right.
It's not an enterprising politician kind of showing up in a stand saying, "Well, what about this?" It's usually a little bit messier. And I think,
I just think the context right now just doesn't doesn't lend itself to that kind of effort. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the McConaughey thing is kind of a perfect example. Was he went and gave a really, really poor interview, and really could not espouse a position on any number of major issues. And I think that kind of brings up the issue here, which is, he can kind of say, I'm for good government, I'm not for divisiveness and all that stuff. But it's like, but like we're having an election where we could talk about permitless carry. We could talk about immigration at the border. We could talk, something that I would think about is like, how about just running the state during a pandemic, Mr. McConaughey?
Yeah.
There's some major stuff. Abortion, we've got to talk about education, all these issues. And the idea that you could just kind of come in and say, well, I'm not really trying to divide people. It's like,
I just want to do the deal.
It's like, well, yeah, but.
Yeah.
it's a little more complicated than that.
That's not really where people are, I don't think. And so, all right, so we will try to get that negative partisanship piece out. I was going to try to work on that before I left town, and I did not. But we're close. So with that, I think we'll probably try to come back and do one more of these next week before this is all over. This being 2021 and the semester here. Until then, thanks for listening. Thanks to our technical production crew here in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. We make reference to all kinds of data on this. You can find that on this podcast. You can find that data and much, much more at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.